Well, kia ora everyone, welcome to Public Policy Institute, University of Auckland's monthly seminar series. And today I have the pleasure of Associate Professor Untitled, the Deputy Director of the Institute. I'll be convening the session today, and the focus of which is a timely one given the local body elections that are actually occurring at the moment, which is transport in Auckland, what is required for inclusive urban mobility. And we have three speakers, and I'm going to just really briefly introduce them now. And in the Māori way, you can provide more context just before you speak. The first speaker is Professor Alistair Woodward from the School of Population Health here at the University of Auckland. Followed by Professor Kim Dirks from Civil and Environmental Engineering here at the University. And last but not least will be Simon Wilson, Senior Writer for the New Zealand Herald. So I'd like to call on Professor Woodward to come and begin our session. Thank you. Oh, and I have some little signs here. Good. Because you have 15 minutes each. And about the 5-minute mark, I'll very nicely put it the first one, and then the 2-minute one, and then the very last one. Okay? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. I don't need to say much more, I guess, except that I'm a public health doctor and epidemiologist. That's my background, so I'm not a policy specialist at all. But I'm very interested, obviously, in how the research we do is used or not used for public policy. And this issue of transport, it seems to me, is important in so many respects that I'm delighted to be here, and I look forward to learning from what others have got to say. I'm going to make 3 points. 15 minutes is not long, I appreciate. And what I'm going to do is to refer to work that I'm involved in or have been involved in. So what I think is part of the knowledge base could be behind transport policy. The slides have got links in them, and my idea was that if any of you are interested in following up, you can go to those links and download the papers that I'm referring to. So these are my 3 points. In terms of transport in Auckland, I don't think we can or should shy away from the fact that there is a big problem. And what's more, in some ways, I believe we're going backwards. So, it's more challenging even than just dealing with what's in front of us, because if we do nothing, in many respects, I think we're going to face an even bigger problem in the future. And then I want to make the point that there are, at the same time, some very desirable and attractive aspects of transport, and I think we should nurture these. We should protect them and sustain them. So, the problem. I'm interested as a public health doctor in health, obviously. So I'm not knowledgeable really about the other aspects of transport, the other impacts of transport that are very important. But if I just talk to you about what we know about the health consequences of transport, this may be helpful. The first point is that the burden of ill health attributable to the transport system is substantial. Indeed, we believe there's good reason to believe that it's of a similar order of magnitude to the ill health that's caused by obesity and tobacco. And that's something that's not widely appreciated. People know that obesity is bad for people. Tobacco, of course, has been regarded as a public health issue for some time. But the transport system, it's both a problem and an opportunity, of course. If we get the transport system right, we believe there are really substantial health gains that can be made. Happy to talk more about how we reach that conclusion if you're interested. My colleague Kirsty Wild has written or has led work on mental health, which is seldom taken into account, but we believe is terribly important. And a report recently published by Waka Kotahi that we wrote argued for some very specific changes in the transport system that we believe are necessary really to firstly understand the effects of transport on mental health and well-being and then fix them. Now, I've put in 2 references to work on climate change because, as I'm sure you know, transport in Auckland is a major source of greenhouse emissions. And if the city is going to do anything about making a decent contribution to, meeting our climate targets, we have to do something about transport. So just two bits of work that I think are relevant. The first is the point about, is climate change something that's making it any difference to New Zealand at all? We're small, we're far away, we're surrounded by lots of ocean. Yes, there is evidence that climate change is already infecting in an adverse way the health of New Zealanders, and this is work looking at heavy rainfall and admission to hospital of children with diarrheal disease. We understand very well what the mechanisms are. There's a 70% increase across New Zealand in hospital admissions 2 days after heavy rainfall. The other point, or another point about climate change that has come up actually in the mayoral election, is this idea that, well, it's maybe a problem, but we can just wait until it arrives and then we can adapt, There's good reason to believe, to argue, that adaptation is not going to be sufficient on its own. And this is some work that Luke Harrington, who's a climate scientist I'm working with, and David Frame from Victoria have done, looking at projections for heat. Auckland is particularly susceptible to heat stress. The good reasons for that I can talk about later. But this projection, if we get a 3-degree increase in temperatures in summertime, that's going to increase the proportion of days above 30 degrees centigrade 60-fold. So that's, just a huge change. And what it means for adaptation, I'm sure you can imagine. In some ways, we're going backwards, and what I'm going to talk about is the increasing size of the vehicle fleet. Best illustrated by the light truck. So I'm very interested in double cab utes in the city, where they came from, why they're here, and what they do, what their causes are, what their consequences are. And this is some of the work that I'm involved in, just to give you a sense of it. Firstly, the idea that light trucks are for tradies. There may be tradies who use them, but the great majority of trips are car replacement trips. They are polluting because they're big and heavy and have bigger engines, and they tend to be diesel. So the work that we've done in the Health and Air Pollution in New Zealand study, we were able to break down the social cost of illness caused by tailpipe emissions to type of car. And as you can see, the impact of diesel utes is 6 times greater than that of petrol cars. The issue about double cab utes in the city occupying street space and discouraging cyclists and pedestrians, Ben Beck has done work, very clever work that you guys in engineering will know about. Ben's an engineer, measuring passing distance from a bike, and found that utes were, on the whole, on average, passed within 15 centimetres more closely than cars. That may or may not be bad behaviour, or just the fact that double cab utes are big and wide and they take up a lot of space. They are poorly designed from a safety point of view on account of weight and rigidity and height. And we've done work looking at the odds of a fatal outcome in a pedestrian crash. And if you're hit by a ute crossing Simon Street, you're twice as likely to die as if you're hit by a car. So this is an aspect of transport that, as I said, is heading in the wrong direction, because utes are exceedingly popular, they're very heavily promoted, and they're getting bigger and heavier year by year. My third point about green shoots. Is anybody a Rebecca Solnit fan? Yeah. Yes, Suzanne is. In her latest book, she writes about George Orwell. And Orwell, was a serious man who wrote about weighty matters like the proper use of language and violence and corruption and war and so on. But he also was very interested in some simple local things like gardens and food. And everywhere he lived, for any length of time, he grew roses. And so Rebecca Solnit wrote this book, about how come such a serious man was involved in something that might seem frivolous and distracting. And she said, so I'm just reading here, what is the goal of social change or political engagement? Can studying what good already exists or has existed be part of the work? There is, of course, a meaningful difference between the dour and widespread position that we are forever starting from scratch because everything is contaminated or corrupt, and the position that the good exists as a kind of seed that needs to be tended more energetically or propagated more widely. She has this phrase, the templates of the desirable. I think that in the transport area, we should look for the templates of the desirable, and propagate them, for sure. And so just 3 areas that I'm involved in, which are, positive and have potential and I think are a route to flourishing, co-benefits, bikes and green spaces. If we implemented climate action thoughtfully, we could have win-wins of this kind. Kirsty did great work during the COVID lockdown looking at what low traffic neighbourhoods do to people's quality of life. We together wrote a paper about satisfaction and happiness in association with commuting. This is the 3rd most widely cited paper in the Journal of Transport and Health, which just has attracted so much attention. We've done work of a more conventional and boring kind, looking at, from the census, at health consequences of different commuting choices. I know Kim's going to talk about the e-bike, but Kirsty's led lots of work on the e-bike. E-madness, I don't want to stop. That was the quote of somebody who had taken up riding an e-bike. And quality green space. It's very hard to find a reason why that would not be a good thing to do. It's just we need to sort of think more carefully about what the quality actually means. But there are opportunities there in what's already an exceedingly beautiful city, great, thank you, to provide more, better green space. And the reason it's connected with transport is that 70% of the public domain is streets, and that's where we need to invest more heavily in greening if we want to make have a big impact at scale. So these are, here are my 3 points, and I think, the narrative about transport is so often one of grievance and anger and loss. But this picture of my grandson Arthur, it could also be a narrative of joy and delight and adventure. And it would be great if we could find a way of tipping the balance a little bit in terms of the tone of public discussion about this topic. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Woodward, for those wonderful words. I should have said at the beginning too that we'll hear from each of the speakers first, and then we'll open up for questions, discussions, debate, policy ideas. It's compulsory for the MPP students. You must answer the question. Right? Yeah. They think I'm joking. Yeah. Okay. So we're just about to switch slides over. And then I'll ask Professor Dirks to come in and speak to us about, I believe, cycleways. Yes. Sorry.
Lovely, thank you, Mark. I guess the speaker. Kia ora koutou, ko Kim Dirks taku ingoa. It's a great pleasure to be here, to be able to talk with you a little bit today about some of the work that I've been doing looking at infrastructure and equity and cycling in Auckland. I've got quite an unusual background in that I started in physics and meteorology as part of my undergraduate degree and PhD, but then spent 20 years working partly with Alistair in School of Population Health, and in the last couple of years decided it was time for a change and moved and joined the Faculty of Engineering, which all sounds kind of crazy, except that what I'm interested in particularly is the role of infrastructure on health and well-being of people living in cities. And so in order to address that problem, it's really about health, it's about the environment, and it's about what we build. So it's been an incredibly interesting journey actually looking at the different angles that people approach that problem from the different disciplines. So it's an ongoing journey for me I'm really enjoying. So I looked at the topics that came up in terms of the flyer and what would be, and thought quite carefully a little bit about, thought quite carefully about what I would talk about. The easiest topic for me is around air pollution and exposure during active commuting, because that's what I've spent most of my, last 10 years at least looking at. But I thought I'd do something a little bit different today, so this is relatively new for me. I kept coming back to this idea of inclusive mobility, and so I thought I'd focus a little bit on some work that's come out reasonably recently involving students within the Faculty of Engineering looking at this aspect. I'm particularly interested in looking at what it is that we can do to get more people cycling, and in particular looking at the ways we can encourage people that are less likely to cycle to actually get on bikes and get going. So what I thought I'd start with is just a little bit about my own experience in cycling. And then I thought I'd talk about a project that we completed last year by a couple of Part 4 engineering students that have to do a project together in pairs. And they conducted a survey of cycling. So it was enablers and barriers to cycling. And then a little bit about some more work that's been carried out by a PhD student who's in progress at the moment, looking more at the equity aspect of it. So in terms of my own experience, I spent my childhood riding a bike up and down the driveway for hours and hours and hours, as many rural kids did, but then really didn't ride a bicycle beyond about age 12, probably until I was in my late 40s. I spent probably 15 years of my career at the Tamaki campus. I lived 4 kilometres away from the campus, but my ride to work was along a very busy road. I had kids to pick up. So first of all, I didn't have a bike. I had access to a car. I had children I needed to pick up after school, right, which is tricky if you're on a bike. The road was horrible. I had a gym membership, so in terms of physical activity, I had access to exercise. And so for me, for 15 years, I just drove everywhere for those reasons. I then moved to the Grafton campus and thought, well, actually also had free parking at Tamaki, which was a good reason to drive there, right? Super easy. When I went to Grafton, I was going to be having to pay a large amount of money for parking, and so that was definitely a deterrent. So I started driving part way and then riding an e-scooter into the campus, and then riding the e-scooter back. So that was quite useful for a year. And then a couple of years ago, I joined Faculty of Engineering at the city campus and thought, well, I'm not paying for parking, it's expensive. How am I going to get myself into town? And at the same time, the Tamaki cycleway got completed. So that was a really nice route in for me into the city. Brand new building with beautiful facilities for locking up bikes. And probably a critical one was that my dad, who had recently bought an e-bike, and decided for medical reasons actually he could no longer ride it, and would I like to permanently have loaned an e-bike. So I had an e-bike sitting in my garage. And then of course my children had grown up, so I wasn't into picking up and dropping off from school, right? So all of these factors resulted in me coming into work on an e-bike, and I did that for a year. And since then I've actually got a regular bike, I've actually got a race bike now, so I'm totally into all types of cycling, so I'm totally converted now. But it sort of took a lot of those different, I guess, events in my life to sort of break down the barriers and get me cycling. So that's probably enough about me, and I did intend to move that along to pictures of the different campuses that I was working on. So during my time, I guess, in terms of teaching, I often brought up examples from this particular study that a colleague of mine carried out, Judith Wang. She used to be at University of Auckland and then moved to Leeds. But I often refer to a lot of the results from this paper in the teaching that I was delivering. And it was all about understanding the choices, looking at potential sort of barriers, and enablers of cyclists in Auckland. She carried out this study 10 years ago, and it involved basically complete a questionnaire of 150, I think it was engineering faculty, staff and students at the university. So she was really interested in finding out, what are the barriers, what are the enablers, what sort of infrastructure are people after in terms of cycling. And so I've always used these results in my study. When I joined engineering, it was really important to come up with some projects for these new Part 4 students. And I thought, well, it'd be really interesting to actually redo this survey and look at how things have changed in Auckland, and particularly in relation to the e-bike, right? Because 10 years ago, it hardly existed here. So have things changed since the introduction of the e-bike? Have things changed in terms of the amount of infrastructure that's been built around the city? So I got a couple of really good Part 4 students onto the project, and so they did this nice little comparison between the two. So I thought I'd just show you some of the results of that. Okay, so this one here is around motivators. So she looked at people that currently cycle, people that could potentially cycle, and people that really won't cycle, right? In some sense, if you don't cycle, chances of converting you over is pretty small. But first of all, she looked at motivators for people who do currently cycle, what the motivators are, and she did a comparison between 2011 and 2021. And you can see from this that actually, the big things are health and fitness, caring for the environment, and, things around kind of logistics and convenience. And there really isn't a huge difference between 2011 and 2021. It's largely the same in terms of what the motivators actually are. This is a comparison of the deterrents, and this is people who don't cycle, who might cycle, or who don't cycle very often, and what their deterrents were. And once again, these haven't really changed a whole heap in the last 10 years, between 2011 and 2021. Okay. All right, so on to e-bikes now. So one of the things that the students did with the 2021 survey was to, instead of just having cyclists, they split it so that people had to identify whether they were an e-bike user or a regular bike user. And so this one here, better make sure I don't get lost, 7. It's easy to get lost in all this, 7, that one. Oh yeah, so e-bike users and regular bike users. And she did a little bit comparison of current users in 2021. So I've circled a couple here. So the interesting thing we found from this, is that the people that currently use e-bikes, one of the big motivators is the fact that they're a lot quicker, that they can get from point A to point B a lot faster than you can with a regular bike. And that's certainly true if you've got big hills and things. And we see e-bikes speeding along thinking, wow, that person's fit, until you realize they've got a little battery and they can go twice as fast. So I think that's why cyclists are the happiest commuters, especially the e-bike riders. They can go really fast. But it's interesting, the e-bike people, it's about speed. But if you look at the push bike riders, it's often around health and fitness. That's their top priority there at 54%. So people that ride bicycles, it's all around keeping fit. Okay, so these are some of the benefits of e-bikes as perceived by people who currently don't cycle or don't cycle very often, and current e-bike users. I thought this was quite interesting as well. A lot of the same items came up. I think what it actually shows is that if you do ride an e-bike, I think you need to ride an e-bike to actually experience the benefits of it, I think is what it comes down to. So things like riding up a hill, people who don't have an e-bike think that that's a likely thing that you're going to get with an e-bike. But if you've actually ridden one, you're more likely to rate it higher, or see that as being really important. Things like riding longer distance, being able to carry more is a big one. Getting to work without getting sweaty is definitely a big benefit. Okay. We also looked at some of the reasons for push bike users for not owning an e-bike, just to see what was going on there. And it looked like actually 75% of people that regularly ride a bike are actually not interested in riding an e-bike because they're happy with what they've got already. For some, a barrier is the cost of purchasing it or running it. So those are the two big things that came up with that. So let's move on a little bit now to looking at infrastructure and looking at how the improvements in cycle infrastructure has encouraged you to cycle, or whether it's encouraged you to cycle more in the last 5 years. And interesting, there's a little bit of a difference, not the best slide here to show that difference. It would have been better to have a little bit of a histogram, but anyway, I think what you can see is that it seems, based on the data that we've collected, that those who ride e-bikes are more motivated by the quality of the infrastructure. And I think what's going on there is that if you are a regular push bike rider, you're probably sort of a well-established cyclist maybe, or a what do you call it, a sort of a die-hard cyclist, versus the e-bike riders are perhaps newer and a bit more tentative. So I think it's just a different demographic of people that ride e-bikes. But certainly more to look at there. I thought this one was interesting as well. And this one was looking at the role of infrastructure improvements and the level of effective desire on cycling more often. And I think the interesting bit for me here was around reduction in speed limits in the city centre. So e-bike riders seem to be they see that less as a benefit compared to people who are on regular bikes. And I think it has something to do with the fact that if you're on an e-bike, you're better able to keep up with the speed of the traffic. And so the reduction in speed traffic is less of a concern. But anyway, interesting to see, I'm not too sure what that means, but that's where we got to. I think another thing that came up really strongly in all of this is the importance of having separate cycleways along the route, and particularly for e-bike users, that's really important, the quality of the infrastructure, the separate cycleway. And I think that's the same thing again, the e-bike riders really need to have the infrastructure for them to feel comfortable in terms of riding around the city. Okay. All right, so some of the big benefits that came out of e-bike riding was being able to travel further. So that means there's a bigger catchment for people that ride e-bikes compared to people on regular bikes, less time and effort needed, and I think also the ability to carry more with you. You can put your pannier bags and you're not going to be weighed down going up those big hills. In terms of infrastructure, the students found that having separate cycle lanes was really important, and certainly aspects of safety was a huge deterrent for people. So it seems like there's a good potential for mode shift with e-bikes, with improving infrastructure. So of course, with all of this, there's a bunch of limitations, and I think the main one was the study size. We only had 150 people complete the questionnaire. Yep, thank you. It was also limited to University of Auckland staff and students, so this is really not a very representative sample of the Auckland population. I think that's a concern as well, and also only focused on the CBD. And if you really want to address the whole issue of providing an equitable infrastructure, then you really need to be talking to people beyond the CBD, beyond university students who are educated, and actually largely male, actually, in the engineering faculty. We're quite heavily male-dominated, right? So you're really looking at a different demographic compared to the rest of the city. So just quickly now, I'll talk a little bit about a study that we've done recently, which is all about looking at people's perceptions of cycling infrastructure and how that influences cycling equity. So this was a student who basically came up with a measure or implemented a measure called a bike lane score. So essentially looked at the provision of cycling infrastructure spatially across Auckland, and then asked people across Auckland what their impression was of the cycling infrastructure that was around where they live, and look at how that was rated and compared it between different demographics. I hope that makes sense. And they came up with some really interesting findings there. And I do suggest or recommend that you go and have a look at this paper if you're interested in this a little bit more. Interestingly, regular cyclists, perceive the provision of cycling infrastructure more highly than people who don't cycle. I just picked out a few interesting findings. Europeans had a lower perception of the cycling infrastructure than others, and I don't know whether this is because if it's people that have had more experience with cycling in Europe, they think, well, actually what we have here doesn't really compare so well. Not sure about that one. There was also interesting differences with Māori and Pacific as well, in terms of the number of people who could potentially be persuaded to cycle. And certainly what came out of the study also is that access to a bicycle was quite a big deal. So a lot of people just didn't have a bike, so that's kind of end of story. So if we could do more to provide people with second-hand bikes, that would be helpful. Okay, so in terms of conclusions from this so far, this is really an ongoing journey for me, this looking at the equity aspect of it, rather than specifically the engineering aspect of it. Good cycling infrastructure is important for encouraging people to cycle, and this seems to be particularly the case for people who ride e-bikes. The perception of cycling infrastructure we found was actually more strongly related to the socio-demographic factors, so things like ethnicity, education, and whether someone is an existing bicycle user than actually what's provided in the community. So in order to provide an equitable access to bicycling infrastructure, it's important really to be planning, with the people that are actually going to be using it rather than just for the people. So you can be providing infrastructure that's sort of evenly distributed about the community, but if people perceive it differently, then it's not necessarily going to be equitable in that sense. There's also a lot of scope for looking at other initiatives, whether it's programs or issues of access, in order to encourage people to cycle. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
That's wonderful. Okay. I'm just going to call on our third speaker, Simon Wilson. I feel really mean sitting there holding up those cards. Jennifer, Professor Kirkman had actually volunteered to do that, so next time I'm going to take one.
So I'm not getting the cards, is that what you're...
Yes, you are getting the cards, sorry.
Ina mana and a reo ina karangatanga maha. Tēnā koutou. Ko Simon Wilson, toko ingoa. So we need to get real. We need to cut ideological spending. They're spending $49 billion on light rail to the airport, and it's got to stop. It's actually a wrong figure. I would buy an e-bike, but there aren't any charges. Where are the e-bike charges? I'm quoting to you from things I'm hearing every night at the moment because I'm following the council elections. So night after night I go to different suburbs and listen to mayoral candidates, local board candidates, ward councillors, telling their audiences what's wrong with the city and what they think needs to happen to it and how they're going to fix it. We need to get real, we need to cut ideological spending. We have a ridiculous situation where people with disabilities can't get to the town hall. This is simply not true. It's all very well making everyone ride a bike, but where is the infrastructure? This from people who don't want cycle lanes. It's all very well making people catch a bus, but where are the buses? This from people who don't want more money spent on bus lanes. I would catch a bus, but it takes twice as long as driving. This from people who do not want to lose any car parks on arterial roads to make buses go more quickly. Why doesn't Auckland Transport put transponders on the buses so when they get to the lights turn green and they have priority access? This from a candidate who also wants cars to go faster. If you think about it, if you give green lights to all the buses, all the cross-traffic cars will be going slow. Every $1 billion over the CRL costs, there will be $500 more on your rates. This is not true in many ways, for all sorts of reasons. They're spending $2 billion on cycleways. Actually, there is a proposal to spend $2 billion over 10 years. It's about 6 or 7% of the total transport spend. It's the smallest single item of transport infrastructure in funding. When I'm elected, we're going to get rid of a whole lot of speed bumps, we're going to get rid of a whole lot of cycle lanes and all the other things designed to get you out of your car. The council is ruining the suburb with its road safety features. We have an incredible high rate of deaths and serious injuries in this country, and it's particularly bad in this city. It's ruining the whole city with the speed bumps and cycleways. I don't want them. If you like them, put them in where you live. I don't want them. Rip them all out now. And this from someone who thinks rates are too high and doesn't want the council spending money on things like, I don't know, changing the streets. You should not be cycling on arterial roads. This from someone who thinks bike paths are a waste of money. They were all just one meeting in the eastern suburbs 2 nights ago. And how about this from another meeting? The city centre master plan is part of a global plot forced on us by shadowy forces. It's virtue signalling, ideological indoctrination. I think it's the phrase master plan that set them off. All those security cameras on the intersections, I'm not convinced they're for security. We should get rid of them all. Council is forcing each household to carry $6,000 of debt. We can deal with that if we stop the lunacy of all these cycle lanes. Council doesn't force households to carry debt. Council carries debt and it manages it absolutely fine. It has top credit ratings to show that. The city centre is unfriendly to cars. It should be freed up for driving and parking. We should remove all the 24-hour bus lanes. Cars roaring up and down the city streets late at night are a nightmare. This from someone who doesn't want to ban cars from city streets. We should get rid of this zero CO2 nonsense. It's a lie. I'm sorry, should I be using that? Would that help? Okay, all right. Heritage is on the chop. That's not true. Cars have been integral to society for 150 years. Actually, they haven't been invented for 150 years, of course. They haven't been common for long-term commutes, like more than a few miles, from prior to the 1950s. My favourite, if they put a cycle lane on the Harbour Bridge, have they thought how many people will jump off? These are comments from meetings all over the city, and they are not, on the whole, ignorant people. I've got to say some are, but on the whole, they're not. On the whole, people saying things like this are wealthy and therefore probably well educated. They live in suburbs full of mature trees and gardens with all the recreational and civic amenities you could imagine, parks and playgrounds and beaches and libraries and community centres and lots of very good local shops. They are the least disadvantaged people in the city, and they complain the most often, the loudest, and the most influentially. They used to run Auckland when it was Auckland City Council, which is the Isthmus Auckland area, because in the old pre-super city days they dominated the voting. But now that we have a super city with the west and the south added, they've lost their majority. Why are they so angry? Perhaps because they know instinctively that change, any change, will threaten their privilege. It's best to have no change at all rather than risk it. But why are they so aggrieved? What is this politics? Alistair used the phrase grievance. What is this politics of grievance from people who have less to complain about than anyone else in the city? I was at a Parnell meeting a couple of weeks ago, and a woman came up to me and she said, "Simon, I'm 83 years old, and I love what you write, and if you're talking to a journalist, that's the first thing you should say, because it flatters us and disarms us." And then she said the thing you shouldn't say, which was, "I don't think it's fair that you want me to ride a bicycle." And the thing you shouldn't say, of course, is to completely misunderstand everything you've ever written. I said to her, I don't think an 83-year-old who doesn't want to ride a bike should have to ride a bicycle. I absolutely don't. If they do, fine. If they don't, of course not. And I tried to explain that to her, but she wanted to keep driving. In my view, a very elderly person who feels that that is the only safe way for them to move around, I don't have a problem with that. I personally don't have a problem with that at all. What I do have is a problem with the idea that people at the edges of normal behaviour, their needs should define what happens for everybody. Most people don't need to be treated like an 83-year-old who feels frail and isolated and nervous about being out in society on their own. Most people don't need that. And so here's the thing. In the council, quite recently, they voted 17-3 for the Transport Emissions Reduction Pathway, known as TERP. This is an extraordinary document that Auckland Council has developed, which essentially says we're going to get to 64% transport, 64% reduction in transport emissions by 2030. It's aspirational, it's enormously brave, it requires all sorts of things that it's very hard to see how they're going to happen, but the council has said, if we're going to hit that target, which is the target we want to get to so that the city will be doing its bit to conform with the Glasgow targets and the Paris targets, if we're going to get to that target, this is how we can do it. So it's a blueprint, if you like, for how we can do that. They voted 17-3, which is extraordinary. You've got, it would seem, councillors who get it. But then they go back to their wards, and on Facebook and in those newsletters, half of them make a point of sneering at cycleways. They argue against T-lanes for buses, and they fight to keep every car park. So they vote one way at the council, and then they go home and tell their people something different. On the North Shore, the leading centre-right candidates never get the name of the CRL right. They always talk about the Central Rail Loop or things like that. They never miss a chance to condemn it as a shining example of Auckland City's waste and incompetence. The CRL, the City Rail Link, won't even have a name when it's finished because it'll just be part of the rail network. It will double the capacity of the railways in Auckland. It's an extraordinary achievement. On the North Shore, where they don't yet have rail, they just dismiss it. And here's another thing. There's now a full-blown war against cycling, and some of those comments suggest that. The shock troops are online and on the hard right, and they turn up as fringe candidates in elections. But it's not just shock troops. There is mainstream support too. Viv Beck, who until a couple of hours ago was one of the leading mayoral candidates, she's pulled out in case you hadn't heard. Viv Beck had declared no more cycleways. Cycleways are not the issue. Cycleways are merely an emotive hook to complain about spending focused on behavioural change. People who do not want us to change argue, finding that cycleways is the way they can get attention. So how do we get change? Direct action is important. Direct action, just ride your bike. Also mass protest, consumer pressure through what you buy and where you shop, corporate willingness, media advocacy, research and analysis in the universities, many other places, and education. But the single most important thing is political leadership. People like me can only do so much. Political leaders are the ones who allocate funds and approve the plans. They don't lead the debate, but they do make change happen. Cycle lanes are a great example of why political decisions are critical. When it's safe, kids can ride to school and people with middling confidence can ride the lanes. When it's not, we'll just drift along. Cycling in Auckland should have reached tipping point by now, but it hasn't. It's partly because of COVID, but COVID could have gone the other way. We could have, out of the COVID lockdowns, we could have become a cycling city. We didn't do that. We didn't have the political leadership to do it, and we didn't have people rising up to demand that leadership. It's too hard. There are hills, there's safety issues, you need an e-bike, as Kim has outlined. So the single most important thing to get political leadership, good political leadership, that's popular action, behaviour that proves the need. It's chicken and egg. You need political leadership to get the popular action, you need popular action to get the political leadership. So all of us have a role to play. And the sceptics are important. It's not just any political leaders. The critical leaders are the ones that the sceptics respect. The ones who already get it have the job of opening the door to the others and helping them walk through it. Those people in the middle who aren't sure need to be helped along. It's absolutely critical. Templates of the desirable, Rebecca Solnit's phrase that Alistair quoted to you. Waitemata Local Board is an object lesson. The commitment of the centre-left and their unfailing politeness in debating these issues has moved the Overton window. Centre-right candidates there now largely accept the priority of active transport, slow traffic speeds and other factors. The centre-right candidate, local board member there some years ago said to me, you know, on this board it's just me and a bunch of cyclists, and he couldn't bear it. He gets it now. I heard him at a meeting one night ago. He gets it, he understands it, he knows we need slow speeds. I'm not sure if he's riding a bike yet, but he could well be. So the anti-war on cars lobby is just a fringe element in the central city, but we need it much more widespread. Voting is important. And what do we want the good political leaders to do? Density is a cycling issue. Density is a transport issue. Density is a climate issue. Public transport networks, active networks for walking and cycling, the rest of the cycling infrastructure, e-bike financial support. Most people in the city, according to surveys that I've seen, have access to a bicycle, but it's sitting in the garage, the tyres are flat, they ride it a bit and then they don't. I ride an e-bike. I get up every day looking forward to the opportunity to ride it. I rode it here from my office, which is over near Victoria Park. There is no faster way for me to get across town than on my bike. I live in Kingsland. There is no faster way for me to get into town than on my bike. And it's safe because it's nearly all on a cycleway, unlike getting across town. But that's my demographic. E-bikes work for me, they work for Kim, because we can afford it, I guess. And because you get to a certain age and you go, I'm going to have some fun. Don't delay fun. We have to remind ourselves. So we need e-bike financial support. Financial support for e-bikes would be the single best way to subsidise e-vehicles of any kind. We already have it for cars. There's a vast amount of work going into how we do it for trucks, nothing for bikes. And the reason is it's not politically palatable. That's the only reason. So what do we do about that? I think we need to be advocating for 4 strategies. 1, quick implementation. Whoever wins, we want a council, we want a city where quickly you put in cheap bike lanes, fast and lots of it. You've got to implement it well. They can't be so cheap that they're dangerous. You've got to normalise it. You've got to have people talking about it all the time, all the time, all the time. This is great. This is how I do it. This is the normal thing to do. And think of the children. A strategy that said, how do we make it possible for kids, for parents, to send their kids to school on a bike safely would be a strategy that created safe cycling networks throughout the suburbs and therefore throughout the city. So what I take from Alistair, what he said, and from Kim, templates of the desirable, my favourite template would be a template for safe cycling to school. Who's going to oppose it? This is a political issue, not simply an engineering or a transport issue. Thank you.